I'm Jennifer. I'm a librarian here. I like a variety of beers, mostly stouts, I guess.
Nice.
I'm Matt McCormick, and I'm a Crown Stein Club member at Essen House, at Great Dane East, and at St. Francis Brewery in St. Francis, Wisconsin.
Cool.
That's my claim to fame.
Awesome.
Jeremy Kautza, Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning. I like IPAs. I think that's my style of beer, if you will, as far as a favorite. One of the things that I really like is going on brewery tours across the state.
Oh, yeah.
Several. So far, Lakefront is my favorite. They do a really nice job.
Nice. I'm dying to do that one.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Donna Swadley, and my favorite are wheat beers.
Uh-huh.
Unless I have to drink a lot, then it'd be a Bud Light.
I understand. Okay.
I'm Dennis Cook. I work in facilities, and one of my favorite beers would be like one from New Glarus, the Spotted Cow.
Oh, yeah.
Hi, I'm Julie Custodio. I grew up in a house with Huber beer.
Oh,
I'm
okay.
down from Monroe, where the oldest, one of the oldest breweries is. So.
Midhouse is another good.
Yeah, well, it's the same thing, yeah.
Okay, good.
That's awesome.
My name is Judy Carls. I like stouts. My husband likes IPAs, and my husband is a home brewer.
All right.
So he does all the fiddling with the different recipes. He tracks them and fiddles with them and all the readings and things like that. I cap.
All right. All right.
I watch the bubbles.
It's an important job.
It is.
I'm Shayna in operations. I like ciders, and as far as beers, I love Belgium. Anything Belgium makes is pretty good. I don't know if those are lagers or stouts,
The Belgians are their own
but
kind.
they're amazing.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I probably Belgium.
Good.
Pretty happy.
I'm Brian Kramer. I work in Cecil. My wife bought me a home brewing kit once for my birthday, and I made a brew, and it was pretty good. My brother has made about 10 brews, and my friend's father is also a home brew guy, so I hang out with him once in a while. He crafts. I flop from IPA type beers to a stout and porter type beers, so those are my favorites.
Nice.
I'm Ann, I'm sorry.
I just want to say the best beer that I've ever had, and I can keep drinking it all day, is Black Bavarian from Sprecher. I just love that
Good
stuff.
stuff. Yeah.
What is that considered? Is that like a stout or? I mean, maybe
Yeah.
it's its own thing.
I would call it like a stout or a porter. I'd have to look at it specifically, but it's roasty, toasty, malty flavors.
Yeah, it's good.
No, it's okay.
I'm Anne McLaughlin-Bears. I work in Cedal, and I like stout, and I also like cider, good cider, which I can't find so much here. But there's a stuff
England,
in
yeah.
Ireland called Stonewell that was fabulous. So that's what I want to do, is make my own cider.
Well, you should hang out with my husband. I can't give it. My husband likes to make cider. His sister has some apple trees. And when they did the fair last year, she went out and bought a whole bunch of many bushels of apples, and there were, I think, 7 or 8 carboys in her basement, one of which was 18%. So she wanted a big one, but we got it.
Yeah.
Nice.
It needs to be mixed with something. But I like IPAs. I like all beers. I'm not picky.
Great. Thank you.
Joe Hansen, I work in technology services. If you forced me to pick a favorite style of beer, I wouldn't be able to pick between like a triple or an imperial. And been home brewing for a couple of years now.
Super.
Justin Hatfield, I work in tech services as well. I'd say I lean towards maybe an IPA or a red ale or something like that.
Delicious. Nice.
Steve Ropsky, I work also in technology services, and my favorite beer is Miller Lite.
All right. So how many people came here? How many people came here today to drink delicious beer? Bad news. It's not going to happen. We have Rolling Rock here, which is pretty nice, but we have a little exercise where we've doctored it. We're going to talk about brewing technology. I'm going to, we have so little time, talk a tiny bit about the brewing process. Bob's going to talk about some helpful pieces of technology that help us brew. Then we're going to talk about some off flavors that can develop. These pieces of technology help you control the brewing process to help you control the development of flavor, and then we're going to taste. So our beer brewing process, really just quickly, usually the grain uses barley. We've got to crush it to expose the inside endosperm and the starch. You want to, when you're milling it, you want to leave the hulls as intact as possible because they act as little filters when you're filtering through. What you want to do is to malt the grains, which means you get them to sprout and to deliver enzymes that convert the starches into stuff that yeast can eat. And then once it's been malted, you can roast it to whatever degree you want to roast it.
Can I jump in?
Please.
So what happens in the malting process is that the grains are sprouted. What happens in the plant's life to sprout the grains is to be able to break down the stored starches that are in the seed. And so this is across the board with corn, other grains, where you start the process, in other words, let it grow and root a little bit. So all those enzymes actually get formed. Then you stop it. Now you got the enzymes and you got your starch. Then you start the mashing process next, which breaks down all those starches.
So once you've got the starches broken down, you do what's called sparging and lautering, and that's basically rinsing them to separate the liquid, which we're now calling a wort, W-O-R-T, and that's what we brew. So the craft brewing program has 3 core classes. There's a class where you learn about the brewing process and about all the different beer styles. Then Bob teaches the brewing science class where you learn about microbiology and fermentation. And the final class takes place on the floor at Ale Asylum, who are our partners. And I brought some toys in from there to show you. Dean Coffey, who's the brewmaster at Ale Asylum, likes to say, brewers make wort, yeast makes beer. So the whole process is to get this liquid that's flavorful and that has the right notes, but then the yeast does the rest and actually converting it to beer. He also says brewers sometimes call themselves yeast ranchers.
Let me jump in real quick here. Here's one crucial area where you can screw up. In your sparging process, you take what's called brewer's liquor or hot liquor. It's just hot water, really, conditioned just right. And you pour that through the grain bed. The hulls in there at this point are keeping your grain bed to the point where the rinse can go through it. If you sparge just means pouring extra water to get all the leftover sugars that are still in there. And if you use too hot of water, or you do it too long, or your pH of your hot liquor is wrong, you're going to pull stuff out of those husks, and you're going to get nasty flavors in your beer.
All right. So once you've got the wort, it's brewed in fermenters. These are some pictures of some commercial fermenters right here. And we have our little baby fermenter right over here that we use in the brewing program. We'll talk more about. When you have it in here, commercial industries use, so controlling the fermentation temperature, you have lagers and you have ales. And depending upon the temperature that the yeast likes to ferment, you use different yeasts and you keep it at different temperatures. So this is a plate chilling temperature system where the water is run through all these different plates to chill it rapidly. But the key takeaway here is that the more you can control your fermentation temperature, the more you can make your yeast happy, the more you can control your sanitation, and the more you can control what kinds of flavors develop.
There's also at this point, well, you've boiled your wort. You want to make sure you cool it off really fast. That's another key point. Once your wort goes into the fermenter, once it's boiled, you need to boil it for about 90 minutes. That's where you add your hops. But at that point, once you're done boiling it, you don't want to take your time cooling it off because lots of chemistry goes on during that short cooling process. So fast cooling stops all flavors from developing. Yes?
What's optimum temperature if you want to handle?
There's varies quite a bit. For the boiling process itself, you want to boil it, vigorously boil. For fermentation, I'm not even sure that
No, it's around, okay, so there's your initial ferment, okay?
100. Yeah.
No, for the initial ferment, you want it to be a little bit under room temperature, more like cellar temperature. Maybe around maybe 50, between 50, 55, roughly. And then, so our brewing practicum instructor, I'll just jump. So this is the baby conical fermenter that we have. And this is a temperature control lid. This has little, you can just open it up. This has little chiller coils inside of it. And basically these holes up here. So this is the chiller assembly. It's on the inside, which cools more rapidly, controls it. You can connect hoses to here and here and run either cool water or glycol through it. And this is a very sophisticated thermometer. And so what this does is it actually controls the pump. It keeps it literally within 1 to 2 degrees. We can pass this around.
Temperature consistency is really, really crucial. There's stages, and it depends on the type of beer you're making, but there's stages of temperatures. And that's what Kevin was describing. But more importantly, that is consistent temperature. So you keep it.
So the Ale Asylum, Joe says that he wants the initial, that there's an initial 24 to 48 hour period where he wants that temperature rigidly controlled, and he wants it, I think, in the 50s. And then there's a secondary fermentation process. Most of the fermentation is taking place, but now it's conditioning more, and that he wants to take place at around room temp, high 60s, maybe even up to 70s, but he wants to keep it below the 80s. So there's 2 different temps that he'll be shooting for on a smaller batch like this.
One thing.
These kits from Menards, it just has this amber colored pony cake kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if I could let it ferment in my basement. Your basement's about 55 degrees.
A little cool.
You can, the deal is that, remember that particularly during the secondary fermentation process, it actually gives off heat. So it will actually shoot to about 10 degrees above what you're fermenting at. Okay, so for the initial one, and some people will take like freezers, and you can buy little temperature control devices, and you can control the temperature of the freezer, and so you can put it inside and then maintain the temperature that way.
Or you can insulate it too, because it is giving off some heat, so you can insulate it just enough to bring it up to a warmer temperature.
Okay, we should keep moving now.
Okay.
All right, so we just covered our little fermentation tank. From there, we're going to, so it goes from the fermentation tank to what's called the secondary conditioning tank, or a bright tank. And remember, so I talked about the 2 processes, the initial fermentation, where the yeast is doing a lot of the major part of its activity, and the secondary part where flavors are developing and the process continues. A lot of times that takes place in a secondary vessel called a bright tank or a conditioning tank. And at the end, they'll add gas in, carbonate it, shoot it into the bottles, and that's how we get you your beer. And so Bob, let's switch over to you.
Okay.
So during that process, Bob is going to talk to you about some of the different toys.
I did also want to mention air. Air is a big factor. Oxygen in the air, more specifically. When in the bottling process, they often put carbon dioxide in the empty bottles first. You could use nitrogen as well, but you want to get rid of oxygen. There's only one step in the whole process that you actually want oxygen. That's when you first put your yeast in there. So you often will bubble oxygen or air through the wort as you're adding the yeast for a certain period of time in order to get your yeast conditioned, because that's when the yeast will use that to actually grow and multiply. Other than that, every other step in the process, you need to think about getting rid of air, including bottling. The reason why tubes go down to the bottom of the bottle and fill the bottle from the bottom up is so that you don't get air in the bottle. So you have an important job of capping those bottles. It even can help a little bit if you're at home to let the bottle sit just for a little bit, so that a little bit of top air on there actually carbon dioxide will slowly build up and replace it, so you won't have air in there. Once you bottle the beer and if you've introduced enough air with oxygen in it, then your shelf life is going to be a lot shorter. You'll get more off flavors. While you're getting that, I can start talking about some of these other things we have over here. So how do we measure the alcohol content in the beer? Well, of course, there's lots of really cool, sophisticated equipment, and if you're interested, ask me. But this is how you do it at home. A hydrometer or a refractometer. A hydrometer simply works on the principle of floating. And if you've ever used one of these, I'm sure some of you have, the easiest process is to twirl it slightly, because then you can read it a little bit better. This is just pure water in here, and it is reading. It should be reading 1.00, and there it is, because it's pure water. Everything is relative to water. I have some mixtures of sugar water, just so I can show you real quick. This right here is brown sugar and water. And your typical wort will have a certain percentage of sugar in it. However, it also has lots of other carbohydrates in it. So the reading on this one is, let's see, 1.13 or 1.3. Now what I did was try to mimic something that's a little more real. This one has the exact same amount of sugar in it. And I also added some cornstarch to mimic what didn't get fermented or didn't get hydrolyzed, broken down. Because in the process of beer, what happens, you have these long chains of carbohydrates, of simple sugars that are built up in long chains. Well, those I forgot the term, in the process of making the wort, you break these chains down into smaller individual units. You're left off with small pieces, small dextrins that actually provide body and flavor to the beer. So when you're doing an actual measurement, you have something more like a real mixture of different types of carbohydrates and then your sugar. And so you can see with the exact same sugar content in these two, but this one has some added starches, we have a measurement of 1.6. So that changed 3 units. Then you take this more like this and you convert it by fermenting it into alcohol. Then you end up with some leftover sugars. Hopefully most of those got converted. Some leftover starches, and then your alcohol. And you take a reading of these. Now the original reading, in this case, would be called the original gravity. That's what they call this, original gravity. This here would be your final gravity. So we went from a 1.6 to a 1.3 on our final. Now the problem is the buoyancy, how much this floats in all the different solutions, doesn't just depend on the sugar, the alcohol itself. So the easiest thing to do your calculations is to get a table and look it up. Because the calculations are quite tricky. You have to take into, if you were actually trying to do a calculation on it, you'd have to take into account every component that's in there. Somebody's already done that for you, creating these tables, and it's fairly accurate. The other way to do that, if you were to own a brewery, would be to buy a gas chromatography instrument, which would cost you about $25,000 or $30,000. Get a bunch of peaks that tell you exactly how much alcohol is in there, and they're not very far off using the traditional methods. So that is how you would measure. Now, there's also an instrument called a refractometer. These run into some of the same challenges. A refractometer, you just put, the benefit is you just need a drop. You put a drop on here to make this wet. All you need is a little tiny bit. And the top is wet. You just look through it, and we don't have an overhead or anything, but if you, I can pass this around.
Pass it around?
Yes, you take a look through it, and you can see that there's a blue, a separation, I guess you could say, blue and clear. And right where it separates is the percentage of sugars that are in there. Now the refractometer is like when you put your foot in the pool and you see your foot looks like it's ahead of you instead of where it is. That's the same principle a refractometer works on. Anything that changes it from pure water is going to change that angle. So it runs into the same issues. Starch in there, your leftover dextrins, alcohol itself, all are going to change it. So you really can only use that for a rough sugar estimate to go from a before to an after reading. That's really the only way you use these particular instruments right here. Okay.
So you couldn't just drink a beer and use a breathalyzer?
That's the fun method, right? Actually, that's how tipsy do you get before you? Okay. Now, one thing you do in the industry is count your yeast cells. Figure out how much yeast you have. In a process that a brewery uses, you recycle your yeast, and some of you might do this at home as well. You save some of your yeast from your previous batch, and you put that back in. You start to grow more yeast from it, and you can have yeast go for quite a few cycles. So one of the experiments we do in the class is to count yeast. So I just prepared a real quick presentation on this. The initial steps is sampling, preparing, and calculations. Sampling is very important because you don't want to just take a look at this right here. You can see this is already separating. If this was yeast sitting in here, your yeast would separate down. If you take a sample off the top, you're certainly not going to get an accurate count. So there's generally procedures written up that are quite precise on where to take your sample from, how much to mix before you pull the sample. Then you want to prepare that sample, which for counting yeast really is not all that much preparation. You add a dye to it, and the dye will indicate which yeast cells are living and which ones are dead. Calculations are, how much sample did you pull, and then you usually take a small part of that sample, you add it to a little beaker, and then you might add some of your dye, and then you put it in your yeast counting cell, which is called the hemocytometer. And all those different changes in the volume need to be taken into account, and then you come up with your final calculation to go from what I'm looking at in my microscope to what's in the big tank. This is a hemocytometer. Of course, for this, you need a microscope for this process. I had the picture on the microscope in the last slide. This is the actual, it looks like a slide, but it's not. It's a little bit more than that. There's actually a little tiny grid on there. Very, very small grid that you can't quite see. And this is set up so that when you put a drop of your yeast-containing solution on there, it goes in at a specific volume that's set for the hemocytometer, certain thickness on it, so you're not stopping any yeast from moving in and out. You want to make sure whatever's in your little dropper is accurately being put into this hemocytometer. This is what the grid looks like. You zoom in with the microscope on this grid, and then you decide which two edges you want to start counting from, and you pick 5 squares in here, and then you count all 5 of those squares. Again, you then multiply by a certain factor to get how many are in that entire 0.04 square millimeter. Use a counter as you're doing it, because you're looking through here counting and punching a little counter. And then the stain you add makes the dead cells dark. The live cells keep moving fluid in and out, so the dye doesn't stay in that cell, in that yeast cell. So the clear ones are the live vibrant cells, and the dark blue ones are dead. You just start counting these yeast cells then. This is one that's average. You certainly don't want to have too many cells. We just did this in class, and we had so many yeast cells that you couldn't even count them. There's hundreds, thousands. Didn't quite work out that well. This is just another picture of a slide with yeast cells on it. So that's the process. That's all I got in my presentation.
Okay, so we've introduced some cool pieces of technology that we're using. One that tests buoyancy, and that measures sort of like our sugar and our starches, and it tells us, going in, if we need to make adjustments about the brewing process. We've talked about temperature control, and that affects fermentation. We've talked about using the refractometer, which actually bends light to check on that, and we've talked about using a microscope to actually check the yeast counts. As Dean says, the brewers make wort, the yeast makes beer. So knowing whether your yeast are healthy and whether you have enough will make sure that you get the conversion process right. So on a practical, so we've talked about these measurements. I'm going to shift over and see if I can get to my next. All right. And so by controlling this process, we control the chemical compounds that are made. If you weren't able to use these things, if you weren't able to use consistent methods and control them, you get flavors that you don't want. So 4 examples of off flavors in beer would be esters, phenols, diacetyl, and acetaldehyde. What do they taste like? What causes them? And actually, let's multitask here. So what I'm going to have you do is, I'm going to go through this while you're actually tasting. So you're going to come up here. So what's going on is, I have a control, sample 1 and sample 2, okay? And I have it written on here. So I'll multitask, so come up and grab 1 of each and bring it back. And what you're going to be doing is, so the control.
You can do this.
I can pass them around.
Okay, it's Rolling Rock.
I can
Okay.
bring some around too if you
I'll have 3.
don't want to all come up here all at the same time. There you go.
Okay, so what you're going to be doing is you're going to be tasting the control and the 2 samples to see where you went wrong in your brewing process, okay?
None of them taste like rubber, I think, or something.
Now, in the outline, it gave 2 things that are possible off flavors, but it's not necessarily the 2 that were in the outline, so you can't count on that for the answers. The first one is esters. Esters can be either desirable or undesirable. Ester is the fruity flavor in British and German ales. So in a fruity ale, it's desirable in lower concentrations, but in a lager, it's not acceptable in really any concentration, significant concentration. And in high concentrations, it has really kind of funky flavors. It could taste like, so classically, bananas or pears, apples. If you look at your handout, you can see some of the other things that it might taste like. So that's one of the things that you're going to be tasting for. Oh, and the important thing to mention about that is that, so higher fermentation temps give you more ester production, and lower fermentation temps give you less production, okay? So this one's about temperature control.
And each off flavor is different too. Some are fermentation time.
Right. Could be the fermentation time, could be your sanitation, could be, and also the rate at which you do it. If you have the right amount of sugars and if you've got a good conversion on your malt and you've got plenty to feed your yeast, then they're going to be happy. But if they're unhappy, then you can get off flavors from them not developing the correct amount of things and the correct concentrations. So phenols, very similar to alcohols chemically. That's the spicy flavor in Hefeweizen or Belgian ales. So they're desirable, again, in some styles and in lower concentrations, but they indicate flaws in other styles in higher concentrations. Also, we talked about your mashing and sparging. That's when you heat it up and when you filter the wort through the husks. If you either have too high a temperature or you have too high pH, then you can develop phenols. So phenols, you see the picture up there, Band-Aids, cloves, smoke, peppercorns, hay, barnyard, plastic, rubber, antiseptic, diapers. Can be nasty stuff. All right.
But the Belgian ales have a certain amount of phenols in them.
Sure.
They do.
Yes.
So it's a case where a little can be swell and a lot not so swell. All right.
Flavors are very tricky to quantify because some compounds, very, very, very low levels, skunky beer is a perfect example. It does not take much to make a beer skunky. Other flavors like the phenols take a little more. So That's, when we do this beer tasting in class, we usually have 3 different levels because some people can taste it at the very lowest level and some at the higher. And it all depends on which flavor it is too.
Right. Okay. Our third choice is diacetyl or diacetyl. It tastes like butterscotch, buttered popcorn, or buttery. It's a natural product of fermentation. Some yeasts produce more than others. It's acceptable. It's almost impossible to avoid at all. Most beer has a tiny bit. It's acceptable in some styles in low concentrations, but it indicates flaws in higher concentrations. And again, higher fermentation temps, more diacetyl, lower fermentation temps, less diacetyl.
Other fuels will also contribute to the flavor itself. That's why sometimes higher or lower, depends on the beer style. But just things like flat beer versus more carbonated beer is going to change some of the other flavor profiles.
Last one is acetaldehyde. It's an intermediate compound in the production of alcohol. Again, acceptable in some styles in lower concentrations, but bad news in high concentrations. And again, higher fermentation temps produce more. It tastes like green apples or fresh cut pumpkin. Okay, so take a moment, taste your control, taste the two, maybe make a couple notes if you like, and then we'll go around and we'll decide if you can detect what you think the off flavor might be.
Used to work for a company where we would add caramel flavoring to fat for cows, because cows like caramel. And we would have a gallon-sized jug of caramel flavoring, and it took me years to like caramel again after that, because when you get a whiff of pure caramel odor, it's not the same as eating a caramel. It's the same with flavors. You get a low level and it's very pleasant, and then that level gets higher, it changes its impression. It can be an apple flavor at a low concentration, but then turns into, musty pumpkin as it gets higher. I kind of liken it a little bit to radioactivity, right? Radioactivity sounds like it's something bad. We want to have as little as possible, but it turns out that a little tiny bit of natural radioactivity is actually healthy for us. Flavors, a little tiny bit of lots of flavors are actually good for the flavor of beer.
Also feel free if you want to come up, why don't you pour one of the solutions in there?
Sure.
And if you want to come up, you can use the hydrometer and take a reading with the hydrometer.
And you can try some of these, the refractometer on some of these. See that if you use the refractometer for something that has cloudiness in it,
right,
you have a hard time reading it.
Don't be shy, come on up.
Yep, number one in there, try to get it to stay. Yeah, but then put a little bit of a twist on it. That keeps it away from the sides. Yeah, it's hard to tell where it's at. That's a one, then we get a react.
I think that's. And then there's so ADD.
I'll tell that volume. The problem with that is you're not sure how many sugars are left over. It doesn't work as well for beers. Sugars, all that's going to change. The alcohol volume is not a good. Yeah, it's reading alcohol, but there's no alcohol in it.
For any, to control quality for any.
So another number that you often see with beers.
It's actually a sensory. Units are, they have a threshold for the
loggers have to stay home.
However much they put in above that threshold is your, that's a single.
So it's literally is tasting.
Yeah. Some analysts,
Has everybody had has everyone had a chance to kind of taste? You have opinions right now? Yes? Okay, so let's go ahead and go over them. So everybody had the control. We have some standards. We got Rolling Rock. We didn't get something too bad, but we wanted something kind of relatively neutral so that the other flavors could come out. What about that that first one.
That was the phenol.
And the
Yeah, phenol.
I was thinking of the esters.
And you were thinking what?
phenols and or esters.
Okay. So,
I had a control that I
I'd
stopped.
say phenol.
Yeah, he's tried to control several times.
what,
Yeah.
you know, what about you guys?
I think another.
Yeah.
You know, so,
Esther.
Jose?
I cheated. I put both in. There's phenols and esters in there, okay? So, and just so you know, you can buy these specialized kits from the Siebel Institute in Chicago. And the first time they ran them in a class, I could not pick out, even though I was a chef, I could not pick out the flavors. They were very subtle. So when I do these exercises for the classes, actually you can do them at varying concentrations. But I think if you taste it at a higher concentration, then you're able to pick out the flavor at a lower concentration. Everybody's tastes are a little bit different. So the thing is, the way I stacked it, the phenol is the most intense in this one. And what we did, honestly, we just used unflavored chloroseptic because that gives off, it has phenolic compounds. And the ester used banana extract, okay? So the primary was phenol, and then there was a background of ester. Good job on the palate. Sample number 2, what did you guys get? Right.
Yeah.
And so when you got that one, you tasted it changed the mouthfeel, didn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, slicker mouthfeel, it's buttery. And we used imitation butter extract for that. By the way, imitation butter extract is diacetyl. So very similar. So I had a question over here. He was still asking me about brewing temps and controlling things in ales and lagers. So what I just answered for the group, a lager, you've got to keep cold, okay? So you need rigid temperature control the whole time. You've got to keep it cool. An ale, you still want to have relatively rigid temperature control during that 24 to 48 hour fermentation. And then after that's taken place, you can let it go to a higher temp and it can be less controlled. It could be out just in your basement. But for a lager, you need temperature control during the whole period. And even for an ale, to get the results that you wanted, you would need relatively rigid temperature control during that initial period. Otherwise, what happens is all of these different types of flavors can easily develop when the temperature isn't controlled.
So let me ask you this. If I want to do an ale, right? And I don't have any refrigeration for temperature control, should I do it like in the fall or the spring? So when it's cooler, I can put it out on my porch?
Yes.
And then move it to the basement or something?
Yes. Okay. Or if you have depending upon your basement, if you have some basements are significantly cooler. But yeah, you would absolutely get better results particularly during that initial period.
Yeah.
Doing that. Yeah.
So before modern technology and all this stuff, would different types of brews be done at different types of the year for the purpose of temperature control?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
Well, okay. It depends upon the region and what the temperature is like there. So in some place like Germany or England where it's relatively cool, and if you've got a dug down root cellar that stays at a relatively consistent 50 degrees, right, that's pretty great for making a ale. Okay. For a lager, unless you have some sort of technology, you really kind of want to do that more during it's hard to get the right temperature for that without the weather helping you.
I want to correct a general impression. The regions and places and times of year that they made beer were done because that was what was available to them, those are the resources they had. A lot of people think, yeah, I want to make this style of beer, from this region in Germany, so I want to mimic that region. That's all fine and good, but those processes didn't come about because somebody was trying to design them. They said, we need to make beer because it's a necessity of life. And it very much was so throughout history. Yeah, and so wherever they could make it and stabilize the temperature, that's what they would do. So certainly they would use certain times of year because they knew they would get a better batch if they only did it in the spring or the fall.
So right now we should do Mind Block?
Yes.
So a lot of the beers traditionally, so right now if you want like a lower alcohol beer, you can have a session beer. They're making some really nice flavorful ones. They used to make a significant number of beers that were very drinkable and lower alcohols for people, for workers and things like that to drink. It was safe to drink. My English brother-in-law tells me that in England, several hundred years ago, any contract signed after 2 or 3 p.m. in the afternoon was considered invalid. Because by that point, they considered you schnockered enough. No, really.
It's true.
The laws kind of tell you things about that. But people were, the water wasn't safe. Similarly, on ships, they would have.
Very recently, people who worked in breweries were still allowed to drink, what they will. I think Coors was one of the last ones to stop it because somebody in their pickup truck went off the road.
Cool. Any other questions for us?
Got any more control for us?
Yeah, the control is, you have a tiny sip, it's this one right over here, you could have a tiny bit more.
You're not driving that soon, right?
Right. So, just to kind of summarize, we've talked a little bit about the beer making process. We've talked about some technological tools that help us control sugar content, starch content, alcohol content, help us measure them to make sure that they're what we want so that the yeast can do the job of converting the wort into beer and giving us the flavor profiles that we want. The temperature that you ferment at strongly affects the flavor profile. We've talked about several off flavors that can develop depending upon if you fermented at the correct temperature, and if you had the correct amount of conversion, and if your yeast were healthy, and you kind of tried them out, and people did a really great job at picking those out. That's kind of our presentation. I'm happy to field any other questions for you. The craft brewing program is a new program at school. People are in it. We have avid home brewers, but we are actually preparing people for the industry. Ale Asylum looks over and approves every piece of curriculum, and they have their expert teaching the first brewing practicum, and he'll be training critical. That using the right chemicals, that washing things, sanitizing things really affects the flavor and the safety of beer. So another important technological aspect of it. We didn't, you could spend hours and hours on that. So we just try to do kind of like a little bit of an overview. Any final questions? Yes?
Is there any technology out there that's able to save a bad batch?
Not that I'm aware of.
That's called Boilermakers?
That's, in essence, what you do is you have these measurement tools so that during the process you can try to make micro adjustments either before it ferments or sometimes like when they're talking about putting yeast in, they call it pitching yeast. Okay? So you can do the yeast measurement with that Bob showed you, and you can actually pitch more yeast during the process if you need to. So you can make adjustments during. Afterwards, very difficult to make adjustments. Good question.
You're usually done with, because the reason why it's a bad batch is because some of the very potent flavors have been produced. And once you get those flavors produced, you're already at a very small level. Trying to reduce that level by perhaps pitching more yeast and getting the yeast to eat it up, very unlikely. There's a few instances where adding yeast actually absorbs some of the off flavors, the spiciness flavors,
right,
and
get reabsorbed.
Yeah, will get reabsorbed. And so if you're trying your beer while it's fermenting and tasting it, and it seems like it has an off flavor, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to turn out bad. You just might not be quite done. That last little bit of second fermentation takes up some of those flavors. But once it's in there, generally it's in there.
Yeah.
I've seen some advertising where or at least they used to do, where they're fermented twice, 3 times, krausen.
Right, and there'll be multiple fermentations in order to get possibly a higher alcohol content or to develop more of a particular kind of flavor. So some instances they will do multiple ferments, yes. So
there seems to be some similarities between this and like cheese making.
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely, because they're both fermentation.
Yep.
Yeah. The fermentation movement is like this thing that's exploding now, right? Fermented foods.
Some of the best foods were the result of accidents.
Absolutely.
Well, there's a lot of controversy here about when and where beer first started, and that's the prevailing thought is that it was certainly an accident, that we were collecting grains and grain urns were left out in the field.
In Egypt?
And no, before Egypt.
Way before.
Yeah, I'm of the school when I look at historical facts that things happened, many years before that we have evidence for them. So probably 15,000 years ago is when the first barrels wheat were left out. Now there's another theory that says that the reason why we have cultivation in the first place is because somebody realized that, hey, these barley grains turn into this liquor that tastes good. It provides actually more nutrition. The fermentation process increases the nutritional value of the barley. And so they decided that they wanted to now try to grow barley. So it's the other way around. Beer came first and then agriculture. Lots of controversial discussion on exactly where it came from.
I don't care.
And some of the earliest records that they found, I think it was like Sumerian,
yes,
are from record keeping for beer and beer taxation.
And that's actually where writing came from. The first writing was done for accounting for the barley and the other ingredients for beer making. So we write because of beer.
Also, another interesting note, we didn't have enough of a chance to talk about water chemistry and pH as much as we would have liked. But pH, it matters for your shampoo, it matters for your tartness. The pH scale was actually created by a person who worked for Carlsberg Brewing. And it was created to help measure beer making.
Completely missed that. We do have a pH meter here, and you can test your water coming out of the tap. Madison has a different water profile. Anybody who's making their own beer at home should get a water profile. You can generally get them for free. That might not be exactly your water quality, but be really close to it from the municipality that you're from, or you can get it tested professionally. But this is showing that our pH of our tap water is about a 6.4. You can't really see it, but you just dip it in and it gives you a reading. Nice little. The sugar water, pure sugar. I think this was the pure sugar water. The reading goes down to about 6.1 or 5.9 roughly. I'm not gonna wait for it to equilibrate. So the pH changes depending on what's, of course, in the water. Let's put some starch in there and it goes down a little bit more. And of course, this one right here that I tried to pretend like it's alcohol, which is actually vinegar. That one, of course, is going to go down to like a 4.5. So having a pH meter, you can use test strip paper as well, but you don't get quite the good reading because 5.2 pH units is actually optimal for the mashing process. And to make it easy, there's products out there that will automatically buffer your mash at 5.2. You can add certain components to your water if you want to try to mimic different countries, different places where breweries, where the water is, more or less hard. Of course, that goes, again, the water was what they used in the location. So Madison has some challenges. It also has some benefits to the hardness of the water. You can add slake lime. You can buy a lot of the additives to water, like Epsom salt, for instance. Magnesium sulfate is one additive. There's debate whether that accentuates the bitterness flavor or not. Depends on who you talk to. We have two people that are helping us out with the class. One says sulfate doesn't accentuate the bitterness. The other one says yes, it does. So there's still, things aren't subtle. I had one student ask me toward the end of the class, I want to make a specific style of beer with certain flavors. How do I do it? And, there's not a good answer to that because you're dealing with a living system. The yeast, certainly, you have to take care of your yeast like they're children. Okay, so lots of different things you can do to try to tweak it, but you're kind of at the mercy of the living system that you're dealing with.
Guys, thank you so much for joining us. If you didn't get a chance, if you want to come up and use the hydrometer, the refractometer, or the pH meter, just to kind of get a quick hands-on experience, please come up and join us and do it. Thanks so much for coming and for sharing a little bit of time with us.
Thank you.
All right.
Let me have another beer. Everybody better put strongly disagree, for I will use this knowledge received at work.
Someone wants to be in there.
I signed mine, Jeremy.
Other than that, it should all be high marks because you got beer.
Yes, so I was surprised it didn't work. I think you said something wrong because I usually.